But tonight I want to talk about what I shall call folk religion, although others might call it family religion or household religion. Sometimes it's opposed to what might be called official religion or state religion, but that's a false dichotomy. It's not that simple. In any case, until recently, the Hebrew Bible was really the only source we had for reconstructing ancient Israelite beliefs and practices. But about 100 years ago, archaeology began to provide new information, and in the last 20 or 30 years, it has revolutionized our understanding of Israelite religion, at least in one fashion. Now, you might think the Hebrew Bible would be an adequate source. The book is all about religion, but it isn't a good source. It's limited, and you will understand if you think about it for a moment. The Bible was written, first of all, long after most events had transpired, in some cases centuries later. Not only that, it was written by a handful of elites attached to the court and the temple in Jerusalem. It was not representative of the majority of people. And it was written by men. Do you think if we had a women's Bible, it would make any difference? Oh, yes. Yes. And finally, the Bible is an idealistic picture of what Israelite belief and practice should have been like had these fellows been in charge, but they never were. The Bible is a minority report. After the committee had done its work, this minority report tries to reconstruct religion to suit the few who wrote the Bible. So keep that in mind. Now, archaeology provides us another window through which to look at Israelite beliefs and practices, a new tool for understanding ancient Israel. And as Oded said, recently I have argued that the Bible is now a secondary source. Don't be shocked. The Bible is limited. I'm going to say something so simple it sounds silly. You cannot wring out of the biblical text any more information than there is in them. That's why it's a secondary source. But archaeology is new every day. There are fabulous discoveries being made in Israel and even in Jordan today that will change everything. So I want to describe for you as a historian what most people were actually doing in the name of their religion. One of my colleagues has said the real religion of ancient Israel is almost everything the biblical writers condemned. That's it. That's it. Now, I'm not making a judgment as to which is preferable or which is legitimate. That's for you. Consult your rabbi or priest or pastor. I'm a historian. I only want to try to describe what it was actually like for most people most of the time in ancient Israel and Judah. I want to start in about the 10th century, the early monarchy, and go through the fall of Jerusalem around 586, moving also from north to south, and dealing with sites that I'm sure you are all familiar with. So hold on, this is going to be a rough ride. May we have the lights down? I don't need them. And I'm sure you'll not be taking notes, so this will work. You are all familiar, of course, with many of the sites we will talk about, beginning all the way at Dan, up on the northern border with Syria and Lebanon, and extending all the way down into the Negev Desert and across, in fact, into the Sinai Desert. These are some of the sites, both named and unnamed, that we now know from the 13th, 12th century. These would represent our earliest Israelite sites. I want to begin a little bit later, when the state of Israel, and the state of Judah as well, emerged in the 10th century BCE. Let's start in the north at Tel Dan, right on the border. The site has been excavated for a long time by the late Avram Biran and partially reconstructed, and here you see something of what the city wall might have looked like around the 9th century BCE. As you approach the site, you come up through a triple entryway gate with a large plaza, and then up through a cobbled street up to a second gate farther up, but there is a gate shrine in the area where you first enter the site. Now, at that point, you see a low stone platform, and behind it are 5 standing stones. Now, these are what the Hebrew Bible refers to as matzevot. A matzevah is a standing stone that commemorates the appearance of a deity. In early pre-Israelite religion, they were apparently acceptable, but by the time of the state and the monarchy, Israelite religion regards these as pagan, as Canaanite. Therefore, you're not supposed to have matzevot. They're always condemned. So what are they doing at Dan, which was one of the most important cities in the northern kingdom and almost the cultural capital in the 9th and 8th centuries? As you go farther up on the crest of the mound, you come to what is probably again a biblical installation, a bama, is a high place, an elevated natural hillock or a platform on which there may be a structure where animal sacrifices and other rites are carried out. What's wrong with there being a bama at Dan? In fact, the book of Kings mentions a bama at Dan, and this may be the very one. That would not be a fantastic claim. So what's the problem? Here's what it probably looked like, perhaps not a temple foundation, but simply a larger-than-life standing altar. But again, these are associated with Canaanite rituals, so they're always condemned, at least in the later portions of the Hebrew Bible. Now, next to that building was a small tripartite building, which seems to be also a temple of sorts, and maybe the biblical Lishka, a kind of shrine adjoining the temple in Jerusalem. And notice it is, like the Jerusalem temple, a tripartite building. Notice the altar there, and here you see it together with a broken store jar into which the ashes of animal sacrifices were swept away. And even there were found iron shovels. Now, these shovels, the altars, the animal sacrifices, all of this is described in the Hebrew Bible. Here is the problem. According to the Deuteronomistic historians, those who wrote or edited the books of Deuteronomy, plus Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, there is only one legitimate sanctuary, the temple in Jerusalem, under the aegis of the royal priest. So these popular local cults are always condemned, and priests and prophets and reformers, especially kings like Hezekiah and Josiah, tried to stamp out the local cults. So already you see what I'm getting at, the disconnect between the biblical description of religion, which was legitimate, and the actual religious practices, the disconnect. Now here is part of a large horned altar. By the way, we use meters, so that's 30 centimeters, about a foot or so. So this is a very large installation, which has now been reconstructed. The only other one ever found like it is at Beersheba in the south. And in the Bible, the borders of Israel are from Dan to Beersheba. Now the problem is, the altars we find for the most part are very small affairs, little things like this. According to the Bible, you could flee to the cities of refuge and cling to the horns of a big altar like this and nobody could drag you away. If you were holding on to one of the little fellows, they would carry you and the altar off. So the altars that we actually have don't fit the biblical description very well. And here you see one of the smaller ones, badly damaged, found at Dan. These are the typical ones, probably incense offer for incense offerings. Now, this installation was also found at Dan. First, it was thought to have something to do with water libations, but we now know it's part of an olive pressing installation. There you see the stone on which the baskets of olives were placed and the weights for the beams that bore down on them, and then the collection basin here. Now, why would you have an olive pressing installation in the temple precinct? Because you're using, cold-pressed virgin olive oil for liturgical purposes. So we have priestly rites being carried out here at Dan rather than in Jerusalem. Here you see also a bronze scepter found at the site, probably carried by priests, local priests, and there was a bronze working installation found, all within the temple precinct. So here we have a full-fledged temple almost under the noses of the writers of the biblical. This was everything they were opposed to. But here it is at a major Israelite site. Now, certainly according to the first and second commandments, there is only one deity, a male deity, and you are not to make any representations whatsoever of him. So we should not find male or female figurines. Well, here we have two at Dan, a male and a female, very Phoenician in style. And this reminds us that according to the writers of the Bible, Dan was a Phoenician site. It was pagan. It was foreign. The biblical writers don't have a single good thing to say about a single king in the north. They're all bad. They're all bad. And everything they did was bad. But that's the reality. In northern Israel, there were these cults, both male and female figurines attesting them. Now let's turn to a second site on the southern reaches of the Jezreel Valley, the site of Tanakh, a sister city of Megiddo. And there both the German and American excavators found what I would call a village shrine, probably serving several households. And here we are dealing with household and family cults. Now we come to Jerusalem, which would be, you would think, the heart of Israelite religion, but I want to say something that will surprise you. Most people in ancient Israel had never been to Jerusalem. They certainly had never been in the temple in Jerusalem, which was a royal chapel and could be visited mostly by the priest and high priest. It was a long and difficult and dangerous mission. And remember that if most people had had the Bible, they couldn't have read it anyway because they were illiterate. As far as we know, perhaps only 1 or 2% of the population was literate. The Bible wasn't yet finished anyway. So I want to suggest to you that the whole theology of the Hebrew Bible would have been foreign to most people. They didn't know about it, they couldn't read, and it didn't make any difference. The temple was of no importance. They probably never met a real priest. It was all about surviving in the agricultural villages where they lived. It was about life or death. Here is one notion of what the temple may have looked like, but in fact nothing survives of the temple, nor will we ever be able to excavate the Temple Mount. The only surviving relic of the temple may be this tiny little ivory pomegranate, not much bigger than your thumb. However, the most recent studies suggest while the pomegranate is original and genuine, the inscription is perhaps added later. It may be a forgery. But what it says is interesting. It says something about set aside or consecrated for the priest for the temple of, and the name of the deity is missing. For years it was on display at the Israel Museum. It was purchased. Most people are now very suspicious. So let's forget about the temple. It was not central to Israelite popular religion as I'm describing it anyway. Next, please. Here, found by Kenyon, Dame Kathleen Kenyon in Jerusalem under the shadow of the Temple Mount, were these figurines. And again, you see the ones with the large discs. And then notice at the bottom, the rather simpler ones. Sometimes the lower ones are called Judean pillar-based figurines because they're found mostly in Judah and mostly in the 8th, 7th century. And the whole bottom looks like a pillar or like a tree trunk. The lower body is not represented. Only the breasts are prominent. That seems to be, as it were, the point of what you're supposed to see here. Next. Now, just to close with some cult paraphernalia, here are the horned altars we've talked about, which cannot be connected easily with the biblical descriptions, probably used for incense, which shouldn't have been offered anywhere but the temple anyway. Next. But if you think about it for a moment, the Hebrew Bible or the Christian Old Testament is not a very good source for reconstructing the real religions of ancient Israel, for many reasons. First of all, the text as we have it was put together after the history of Israel was over, after the fall of Jerusalem in the exile. And the Bible, which is not a book, but a whole library of books, was written by a handful of elites, and they were all men. Do you think if we'd had a women's Bible, it might be different? Oh, yes. But these were elites. They were members of ultra-right-wing orthodox nationalist parties. And what they did was to do revisionist history. They rewrote the history of Israel, although they had old sources, and that's the story we have it today. Now, I ask you to remember that the Bible is a minority report, written by a small committee. It provides an idealistic picture of what Israel should have been, but never was. It would have been had they been in charge, but they never were. So what you get is a portrait, all right, but it is a portrait of a certain Israel that is a later construct. Where would you go to find out about the real Israel in the Iron Age? Another source, and Margaret talked about several sources, and brought to you a lot of fresh insights from sources that are neglected. Now I have another source, archaeology. Archaeology is about a real people in a real time and a real place. They really did exist, and now we know a lot about them. Remember in Daniel 12, there's a wonderful phrase for all those who sleep in the dust. Those forgotten people who, in the words of Eric Wolf, are the people without a history, without any written history. Those anonymous masses that have been forgotten. Archaeology brings them back to life and gives them a voice and allows them to speak. And they speak from a different perspective.